Prashant is an affiliate technology and operations management professor at INSEAD, faculty director of the INSEAD Africa Initiative, and lecturer at Harvard Medical School. He is a globally recognized scholar in the area of healthcare supply chains. Prashant is the author of many peer-reviewed scientific publications about manufacturing and delivery models for health technologies in frontier markets. His work has been featured in prominent print and broadcast media, including the Financial Times, Nature, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, CNN, and BBC. It is a great honor to welcome Prashant Yadav to the SAPIC stage.
Sorry for the letdown, I'm not Prashant. But I'm jumping up here for the opportunity to actually say to Prashant, we really appreciate that you're here. And there was a long introduction. But the best way to describe Prashant is, I feel as if I've known him for 15 years. Not because I have, but because in the healthcare logistics supply chain space, there's almost nothing that happens that people don't ask, what does Prashant say? And that's the beauty of having a person that's been deeply involved in the profession, in supply chain, but also having a very, very strong academic background and working with us in the industry. So thank you very much for being here. We're looking forward to your session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Copus, and thank you for organizing and inviting me, and thank you all for coming to hear some of my thoughts this morning. I'm a professor of technology and operations management. I'm in the professor of practice track at INSEAD, which is a business school in France and Singapore with other campuses or hubs in San Francisco and Abu Dhabi. So we are a business school for the world. I also run the INSEAD Africa Initiative, which is an attempt by our business school to deepen our engagement in Africa. So what I'll share with you is things that I have drawn out in looking at companies that are changing the way they operate their supply chain. One of the luxuries of being a professor is that many of your former students go out and become part of supply chain organizations. They rise up, and then if you call them, they do answer your phone call. And if you want to hear about how things are progressing in their company, they oftentimes share with you. When you want to go through the formal route of asking them, is this a research project that you will collaborate in? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. But I've had some ability to capture these over the last 4 or 5 years predominantly. And while most of what I do is focused on healthcare supply chains, what I'm sharing with you this morning isn't healthcare supply chains alone. It is a wider angle lens at things which are changing in the supply chain profession, in particular amongst companies which I call as vanguard companies. And I'm very consciously not using the word those who excel in supply chain management or those who define supply chain excellence, because in my past job, we embarked on a multi-year research project to define what supply chain excellence means. This was the MIT Supply Chain 2020 project, and my colleague Larry Lapierre ran it. And we essentially came to the conclusion that there's no way to define supply chain excellence. My colleagues who work for some of the research firms who do put out these lists to say what constitutes supply chain excellence may disagree with me, but that's my starting basis and conjecture. So what I want to do is go back to, and we are starting to use these disclaimers, at least in academia these days, because it's very difficult to know what was your content and what was generated by AI. You will see that some parts of my presentation have been generated using AI, image and cognitive generations. Okay, so what I have to do is start by defining our planning and execution paradigm, without which I cannot tell you where the vanguard companies are changing. So bear with me, it may sound like here is a professor who's taking us back into a supply chain 101 class. That's not the intent, it's just to level set how we currently operate. And from there, we'll talk about where do I see the biggest changes happening amongst companies. Okay, sorry, let's go back. So, simple company or organizational strategy. That's where you define what product, what features, what price, what delivery channel are you going to play in. So essentially, it's the answer to the question, where do you want to play and how will you win? Right? Those are the two basic questions that strategy answers in any organization. And in the how do you win comes a lot of operational capabilities. Will you be able to serve at a cost that still leaves you at the price which you included in your product bundle and said, I will deliver this product or this product bundle through this channel at this price. Now operations has to get you a cost that still leaves you a reasonable margin. That's corporate strategy. Now, before we got into this world of what we now call as supply chain strategy, life was simpler. We had a function which is largely what we sometimes call the sales and operations planning. There may be other words for it. But essentially what it was doing was it was saying, okay, you define some strategy, and I will help plan and execute the logistics network to deliver on that strategy. And sometimes in doing so, I will go back and change the very core components of the strategy, such as your product. I'll bring some feedback in. Sometimes I'll ask you to change the price because I'll realize that cost is not feasible. Sometimes I'll ask you to change the delivery channel. Sometimes I'll ask you to change your target customers. Right? That was the way we operated. So there were things such as how do you design your capacity, how do you design your network, and then at a more operational level, you do the basic functions of what the score model lays out in some ways. So that's our starting basis. In doing so, our fight in many organizations oftentimes was what happens in that strategy layer is exciting. That's where the big management consultants make a lot of money. And while we focus on building the real operational capabilities to deliver, we here being what was originally the business logistics community and now is the supply chain community, we remain merely the execution arm. We don't get the mind space, the visibility into what the strategy people are getting. Right? So that was a fight in the profession for decades. Ever since I have known, people saying, I'm getting a space in the executive committee. This is the only company that has invited the chief supply chain officer to join the executive committee. Right? Those were the discussions that 10 years ago started. And now, we invented something in between which we call as supply chain strategy. Right? It's a very fuzzy concept. You all may like it, but the reality is that if strategy was fuzzy, supply chain strategy is fuzzy to the many powers exponential. Why? Because without necessarily having a strong basis for what constitutes supply chain strategy, this was just largely a way for the core on the right side to somehow find a place for itself in the strategy room, in the executive team of a company. So we said, yeah, we also do strategy, which was essentially, we do 5-year plans of how we'll run our network, where we'll open the plant, which were largely network design plus in some ways, right? So we have to accept that we created this layer, and many times this layer started encroaching on what the core questions of strategy were. And we felt excited about that part, that now the supply chain people are also saying how to win, where to play. They don't just tell me this and I execute on it, right? That's the world till a decade ago. And then, so as a university professor, the simple way of representing it, or the mathematical way of representing it, is that most of what we were talking about was deciding which nodes and which arcs to activate over a long period, where to open a plant, which supplier to select, how much to move on each arc, which carrier to pick, how much to move you the carrier. Right? So that's the set of questions we've been solving, which were largely network design in some level. And we had a planning horizon question here. Let me go back. Sorry, 1 second. As you move from left to right on this graphic, you are becoming more and more precise on time and geography. Right? So you are talking about a retailer, a customer, a health facility. Next hour, one day on the right side. And on the left side, you're talking about 5 years, an aggregate geography, right? So you're becoming more granular as you go to the right towards execution, both in space and time. That's something to keep in mind, both in space and time, because I'll come back to it in what I come to next. Okay, so that was the way we operated. Now, there are companies which said, do I have to keep this time and space granularity division between what you call a supply chain strategy, network design, and supply chain execution? Why do we have to keep that separate? That's the fundamental question they asked. And examples of these companies are a big e-commerce company in Seattle, many other last-mile companies that have emerged, one big retailer in Arkansas, right? Many of them started asking the question, why do I have to keep these three separate on time and space? And soon what they started realizing was the reason we had this, that we would do network design, planning, execution at different levels of time and space granularity, was because there are trade-offs in making those decisions. You pick something which is more responsive, it's less cost efficient. You pick something that's cost efficient, it's less responsive. And we thought that solving those trade-offs at a local level in geography or at a shorter time interval will not give us the best answers. Because when you aggregate over time, you can make those trade-off decisions better. When you aggregate over space, you know that this particular retailer may not be solving optimally, but when I took a bird's eye view of my whole network, I will solve it more optimally. That was the fundamental reason why we said supply chain planning, network design, and execution are separate activities. And we'll try to link them through some kind of hierarchy where you say, first you'll network design, then you'll plan, then you'll execute it. The new age companies started asking more fundamental questions. And they said, why can't we solve the trade-off in quasi-real time and at the lowest level of granularity? Why can't someone who's the delivery truck driver be given the tools from supply chain technology so that while solving that decision in the process of making a delivery, they will still make that decision to be as close to globally optimal as one can make? And there was a lot of back and forth on this. There were fights amongst companies. This is not possible and whatnot. But what we came to realize was that in a simple case, if you are talking about those who said doing it in real time hurts you, we're essentially saying, oh, a customer placed an order. You decided you are going to serve that customer from this particular distribution center using this particular carrier. That was a static planning. In the new age, you are deciding it real time on the fly. Aren't you foregoing the chance that if their neighbor placed an order, or if the customer later on decides to add more units to their basket, you will lose that. So therefore, you will not be optimal. But the reality is, the new algorithmic technology allows you to bring that in very, very quickly. So the driver, as they are going, can still receive a rerouted plan, can still receive new things to add to the basket before the pick and finish in the warehouse has fully happened, and still make it as close to globally optimal. That shifted the boundary between supply chain execution and supply chain strategy and planning. Right? So in some companies, the idea of supply chain strategy, even though they are the companies which are truly the vanguards of supply chain management, the word supply chain strategy is banned in their executive team. Why? Because they figured that will make people think, I have to plan in a rigid asset manner for the next 5 years, whereas what we want them to think about is no rigid assets, everything is dynamic. So if we let them say supply chain strategy, then they will start designing things in a rigid manner, right? It's not that they're not doing long-term planning. In fact, most capital expenditure is happening with a long-term plan, and the capital expenditures are large, so they have to justify with a long-term plan. But it's just that the mindset shifted from I can design it for the next few years, then I'll pass it on to the next level, then I'll pass it on for somebody to execute. No. So that's one big change, which you'll see cut across the parts of my talk. And another interesting thing that happened is that while we were fighting to talk about bringing supply chain strategy to the boardroom, the vanguard companies brought order fulfillment to the boardroom. Why? They said, If we ask the guy who's the chief supply chain officer and talks about supply chain strategy, they will present a framework, they will present some beautiful slides, and the investors are going to say, yet another corporate strategy. How is this different than strategy? So instead, they brought in the order fulfillment team, which described to the investors the customer order to cash cycle very visibly, very clearly, and that's when the investors and the executive team said, I get this. This is the line of our business that translates the order into money. This is how it does it, and this is what they are doing to get me that faster, better, with lesser capital stuck, whatever things they care about as performance metrics, right? So while it may seem trivial that it was not the supply chain strategist, but the order fulfillment person, it's a non-trivial argument about who went to make the case for supply chain management to the investors in large companies. Not the supply chain strategist, but the order fulfillment person. That is a big change, right? And we have to think about that, how we bring it about in other organizations, in other industries where that has not happened as systematically. Okay, so sorry. The other thing that some of the vanguard companies are doing is they are reiterating time and again the fact that every delivery that you make, every order that you fulfill is a learning opportunity. Right? So when order gets delivered to a customer, we think, oh, I met my SLA, I met my performance OKR, that's what I should be focusing on. But somewhere you're embedding the fact that if you delivered the order on time, not on time, doesn't matter. We have to embed a strong learning component because every order delivery is an opportunity that we should not miss to learn about something. Now, some companies thought this learning opportunity is in the form of data science, which is they will have data collected. But the word data is very fuzzy. Because to a lot of people, while it may not mean the same to you, but to a lot of people, data means there'll be a number attached in a data table. But the learning opportunity in every delivery was not a number. It was sometimes tacit knowledge, non-codified knowledge. So what the vanguard companies did was made efforts to say, what is today non-codified knowledge about what happens in my delivery, I will make it codified so that it exists across my organization, so that what one delivery driver learned, I can communicate to the other so that the local optimization of these complex trade-offs can happen in quasi-real time at the lowest level of granularity. Embedding that into the supply chain organization's culture was extremely hard amongst the vanguard companies, but at least a few of them have done it reasonably well. So what I want to ask then is, okay, some of the companies are doing this, they are clubbing the two functions together. What are the common threads among these? There are 5 that, according to me, stand out. The first one is that the voice of the customer function, again, this is not the same thing as visibility of the order getting delivered. The voice of the customer function is a slightly different function that is getting integrated very tightly into the supply chain function. There are 4 or 5 leading examples of companies who've done that. Unilever would be one, but many in the CPG industry have brought Schneider Electric, lots of companies have brought the voice of the customer and the supply chain function together much more meaningfully. Once again, voice of customer is more than just data about what was sold to the customer. It's not point of sales data, it is truly the voice of the customer. The second is what we've learned from the companies who've succeeded in their supply chain transformation. Lots of theories, lots of academic ideas about what constitutes the success factors for supply chain transformation. But besides the other ones that people talk about, one important one is the ability to negotiate and get CapEx approved early on in the start of your supply chain transformation, so that you don't keep going back every year and say, okay, now I'm progressing, but my network needs a little bit more money. You get it upfront. And is there a trick? Is there an easy way to do it? No. But the successful supply chain officers are getting money, when I say money, not OpEx, CapEx at the beginning of the transformation cycle in big chunks. The example here is Walmart. Right? Most retailers spend, or historically retailers used to spend a large portion of their CapEx on building new stores. Because if you're in the retail business, where is your capital going? Traditionally, we used to think, oh, we are creating new stores. You need money to buy land, to build the store, to build the DC, to build the warehouse, to buy assets, whatnot. 72% of the CapEx in 2021 to 2022 was spent on supply chain capability and technology building. That is a big number. Right? We're talking about at least $15 billion with a B going into CapEx for supply chain capability and technology. That was not, I'll come back to you every year, Mr. Chairman or executive team. That was, here is our plan. I need commitment to allocate this over the next few years. So that is an important part. We sometimes don't think about it. Execution of corporate strategy, once again, not supply chain strategy, executing corporate strategy. I talked about the trade-offs. And the last thing is that when you ask the successful supply chain officers in these, what I call as vanguard companies, what did they do in terms of bringing about their transformation? Again, nothing new to you. They didn't say, none of you are going to say, yeah, I don't accept that culture is an important part in supply chain transformation. But what is unique here is that there was a deep acknowledgement. It's one thing to be at a conference and say, yes, we care about supply chain culture in our supply chain function. But a deep acknowledgement of this fact means they built so many things. They sometimes had to change standardized processes to something else because that's what was the culture that was driving it. Sometimes you can't change the culture. You had to change the process to fit the culture. Sometimes you could change the culture to fit the process. They were constantly iterating between these two as and when needed. That was a defining feature amongst the vanguard companies. Okay, so one last thing about this, and then we'll talk about a few, 4 more ideas. So I have a colleague at INSEAD. His name is Peter Zemsky, strategy professor. And what Peter's been doing is a lot of people talk about AI these days, and lots of interesting ideas, some not so good. But Peter's work is you can actually do strategy using Gen AI. And you have to see it to believe it. I used to think, okay, another one talks about AI and strategy. But the reality is that if you look at what it does, many of the consulting firms will truly be shaken up by the kind of a strategy, framework, analysis, with numbers if you want to give numbers, if you just want to get basic strategy, it creates. So why this is important? If you were so excited about your supply chain strategy role, that's the one that's not going to be as exciting because somebody can do it reasonably well. But if you are the execution specialist, it's a long way before robots or anybody else can solve that problem because the execution piece, and this sounds counterintuitive because we used to think automation will solve the supply chain execution problem. Let me remain in supply chain strategy. What I'm saying is completely opposite. Supply chain strategy, the design of strategy, et cetera, can be solved by Gen AI plus integrating new frameworks into it. Execution will be hard, and no degree of automation will solve the real value of it. Okay, so I want to present to you 4 ideas which I hope can advance your supply chain toolkit, irrespective of which industry you are in. The first one is about accepting and internalizing trade-offs. This is a lesson that companies have been asking, and I have been studying fire departments across the globe. The interesting part about fire departments is you can critique your local fire department and say they were not so responsive, they took longer, but around the globe, around the spectrum of development and development GDP per capita, country development, fire departments have commonalities in how they are organized, and for a reason. Because they accept the trade-off that if you want to be responsive, you will need to have some capacity slack. I have a young son who jokes around and asks me, why do the firemen just keep climbing up this pole and sliding down? I don't know, but this is a great job. They don't do much. So the reason there is a buffer built in to the way capacity is designed is accepting that trade-off, that if you want to be responsive and resilient, you have to have some spare capacity. Right? Every fire department in the world, you can do a study, you can go visit your counties or your local community's fire department, you will find that it rarely is the case that we're saying every fireman is occupied, just doing something. So responsiveness and capacity. The second interesting thing is that fire departments are very flat in their organizational hierarchy around the world. There is a fire chief, there is a deputy chief, there is a senior fireman, and there are firemen. I'm saying men because that's the term that they use most times. I don't know if there are, like, I should call them fire person. But that is the kind of hierarchy. It's never that if you are a really big fire department, then you have 6 layers or 10 layers. They defy this idea of management span of control. Management span of control says that a manager can only manage 5 people or 6 people, and then you have to have another layer. Fire departments don't believe in the idea of management span of control. They believe in there should be 4 layers between the fire chief and every frontline worker. That's it. 3 is better, but 4 is the max. Right? So that's another thing. Organizational hierarchy is flat in fire departments. They also don't work on a pay-per-unit pricing model. Right? Imagine saying, okay, now you're here, you extinguished my fire, here is the invoice, let me pay you money. Right? Because for some responsiveness business models, pay-per-unit pricing will never work. It has to be a subscription model. So it reminds us that if the executive team is saying, can you design your supply chain execution plan to be highly responsive because that's what we care about, that's what we've defined in our strategy, you have to say, are we charging our customers a fixed unit price? Is there a way to look at a subscription pricing model? Because that's what can allow us to build some spare capacity, and that spare capacity will give me the ability to be responsive. How will I create that? So there is a big consulting firm, I won't name them, who did a study about the San Jose Fire Department. And they said, they trained in a business school most likely, and they said, you know what? We looked at all of the fire stations in your county, and we find that you have so much excess capacity. So you have to fix this problem, you have to keep them more occupied, and so on. The city of San Jose took their operations efficiency plan, implemented it. Ironically, the San Jose office of this very consulting firm had a fire 7 years after this study. And their executive team was asking, why did it take so long for the fire tenders to reach here? So it's a somewhat sad story, but a constant reminder of what we have to do. While we're talking about firemen, I also want to remind you about something interesting that I've learned as I had discussions with the fire people, is that they said, you know, you talk about supply chain networks, Prashant. We have something else we want to share with you, which is we break our networks into sub-networks to prevent cascading. These are what we call as fire breaks in forests. If you go in any forest, you'll see these lanes are cut because they're doing 2 things. First, if there is a fire, it's giving access to the fire team, but more importantly, it is not allowing the fire to cascade, and it is creating sub-networks. Right? So if you really care about responsiveness and resilience, think about your supply chain network and see, can sub-networks function on their own? And can you create the equivalent of the fire breaks in your supply chain network? My favorite example is by studying a biological phenomenon, which is the bacteria E. coli. If there are any microbiologists who want to correct me, please do, because I have no formal training in microbiology. But I studied this phenomenon for the reason that when we talk about resilience and agility, I ask the question, E. coli is that bacteria which survives heat increases the farthest. That's why we have so many E. coli food contaminations that we see across the world. How does it do it? What is unique about E. coli as compared to other microbial agents that you boil them and die, but E. coli, you keep boiling it, it still survives? So there is something interesting, which is a combination of a feed-forward and a feedback loop. What happens in most microorganisms is when you start heating, they realize heat is coming. This will destroy my proteins. Let me start folding my proteins. So there are agents that go in and send the signal to start folding the proteins so that they don't get destroyed by the heat. That E. coli does as well. That's called a feedback loop. But what else does E. coli do is it does a feed-forward loop, which is it senses that when the temperature in that boiling pan has stopped increasing, it says, oh, that means they're not going to put up any more heat. They put their maximum flame. Now, it stops folding the proteins and starts opening them at that time. Why is that important? Because most organisms die not because of the protein dying. It is because they fold so much of their protein that the metabolic work that has to be done to open them back kills the organism. So you overfold it, you over-respond it. Right? So that is a common problem we see in some supply chains, which is the moment you see a signal, you over-respond. You overfold your proteins, you say, I'm protecting against that. Whereas what E. coli is doing is it's saying, no, things have become okay, the temperature is not increasing anymore. I have a feed-forward loop, which is looking at what future will look like and bringing it back and saying, I stop folding because otherwise my metabolic workload will shoot through the roof and I'll die anyways. So that's an important consideration in designing these feed-forward loops of projecting what things will look like, bringing it back. And the vanguard companies are doing that. A story about watchmaking. So this is not my story. This was a fable that Herbert Simon started talking about. So imagine there are two fine watchmakers, Hora and Tempus. Both of them make these super fine watches somewhere in Switzerland or wherever in the world. And Hora says, I keep assembling there are about 1,000 little pieces that go into making a fine watch. I keep assembling them. And Tempus says, instead of just assembling them, I first assemble sub-assemblies, and then I will bring the sub-assemblies together. Hora says, Tempus, your watch will not be that great because you are spending your time building these sub-assemblies. Tempus says, we'll see. As they are building their watches, occasionally they get calls from home, family calls, customer calls. Hora, the moment Hora has to leave to attend to a call, when Hora comes back, the time, because if you're assembling 4 or 5 parts, they fall off because you couldn't finish the last rivet to keep them together. Whereas Tempus was building sub-assemblies, so the only part they have to restart at the max is a sub-assembly. Hora's time lost is larger. What it shows you is the benefits of modularity. Right? A lot of companies have figured out how to do things in modular manner versus doing it in large single assembly platforms, and that has created resilience and agility. This is an example that you might have heard of. There are lots of logistics people in this room. I will nevertheless take the risk of describing it to you, which is the assumption is that if you standardize your processes, you lose agility because everything is standard. You're not giving the person the chance to do things when they need. UPS, which you know, this is Louisville, Kentucky, the big distribution hub. Lots of planes come in, lots of planes go out, small parcel business. You know how the system operates. But this is in a part where there are frequent snowstorms. Right, so imagine a big snowstorm, 5 feet of snow all around. Now, a lot of people who think about resilience said, oh, how will they clear the airport? Oh, this is UPS. This is their biggest hub. Cleaning the airport is the last of the problems. There are enough assets for UPS to clean Louisville, Kentucky's hub airport within hours. Right? This is a company which has that asset base. What is the trickiest part in resilience is the staff that work in the picking line. They don't live. This is rural United States. They don't live anywhere close to this facility. Many of them drive 100 miles. Some drive 3 hours, 2 hours, long distances. How will they come to the site? Now, yes, you can call the governor's office and say, I'm UPS. This is my biggest operation. Please get every road coming to my location cleaned. Governor will say, well, this is how many snowmobile vans we have or other equipment, so it'll take a while. What can they do? Those of you who know the story are not allowed to answer, but those of you who don't know the story, Say it again. Clean the roads themselves. Use the big asset base that and the capital that you have to bring it and so on. They also have another airport, another hub, which is not as big, or about the same size in some respects. That's in Atlanta, Georgia. Right? They can fly planes in, they can fly staff in. It is easier to fly somebody in because the airport runway is clean. And then have them start working on the picking line right away. But what does that assume? That assumes that the workstation of the person who works in Atlanta looks exactly the same when that person lands in Louisville, Kentucky. And the process of taking a picking sheet and filling it is exactly the same. So process standardization builds agility, contrary to what people think, which is, oh, if you standardize, I don't have agility. When you standardize in large networks, you build agility. This is the most known example, but I can give you many, many examples of why this is true. Okay, so in summary, I want to talk about the 5 main things that I started with. Bring the order-to-cash process into the boardroom. And I'm using the word boardroom here loosely. If you work for a nonprofit, if you work for the government, bring it to the highest levels of leadership. Don't bring a supply chain strategy presentation. It will not go far. Bring the fulfillment people to meet the investor type, and they will say, now I get it. And this may sound, once again, oh, you're going back to the days of strategy execution. We had progressed so far along and become strategy people. You're taking us back to becoming the lorry and the carton box warehouse guy or gal. But that's what we've seen amongst the companies that have succeeded. The tech and people that you need for building supply chain capabilities. Tech and people will not come without significant resourcing. Saying that we can, for example, I work with lots of healthcare supply chain organizations, saying that we can fix this problem with little capital outlay is doing the biggest disservice we can do to patients, to society at large. Let's be honest, we cannot solve it without capital outlay. And when I say capital outlay, people think, oh, so you're saying we should be building warehouses and supply chain infrastructure? No, 72% of Walmart's capital outlay went into people and technology for supply chain. So we need resourcing, not necessarily for warehousing, but for people and technology. I talked about process standardization, internalizing these trade-offs, and of course, the fact that culture truly eats all kinds of strategy things for not just for breakfast, but for lunch and dinner and cocktails and everything else that comes afterwards. So I have 2 minutes left. I want to stop here and leave some time for people who have comments, critique, war stories that they want to share from their own work. Thank you again.